A Mustang horse battles for survival. See who came to the rescue. Dark clouds covered the sky, turning day into night. The wind howled through the valley, shaking trees and sending leaves flying. Then came the first crash of thunder, followed by a flash of lightning that lit up the sky for just a second. Moments later, heavy rain poured down, soaking the land in an instant. Rivers overflowed, and water rushed through the valley like an unstoppable force. The flood spared nothing in its path. Branches snapped, rocks tumbled, and muddy water swallowed the ground. It was nature's fury at its worst. In the middle of the chaos, a wild Mustang named Storm was fighting for his life. His strong legs kicked against the fast-moving water, but the current was too powerful. Every time he tried to get his footing, the flood pulled him further away. His muscles burned from exhaustion, and his eyes were wide with fear. Storm had spent his life running free across open fields, but now he was trapped in a nightmare. His nostrils flared as he gasped for air, his body sinking deeper into the cold, rushing water. He struggled with all his might, but the flood was winning. The storm showed no mercy. Storm's powerful body was no match for the raging water. His hooves scraped against unseen rocks and debris, his strength fading with every second. Then it happened, his head slipped beneath the surface. For a brief moment the world went silent. The rain kept falling, the wind kept roaring, but the Mustang was nowhere to be seen. Then, out of the darkness, two bright headlights cut through the storm. A truck screeched to a stop near the flood, and a man stepped out, his eyes locked on the drowning horse. The Mustang had one final chance. Would help arrive in time? Ethan Walker had been driving for hours, his old truck cutting through the darkness of the storm. The wind howled like a wounded animal, bending trees to their breaking point, while rain pounded against the windshield in relentless sheets. The wipers worked furiously, yet they barely made a difference. The world beyond the glass was a blur of shadows, flickering headlights, and the occasional strike of lightning illuminating the flooded valley below. He hadn't meant to be out this late. In fact, he hadn't meant to be anywhere at all. His life had become a series of endless roads and nowhere destinations. Town after town, mile after mile, always moving forward, yet never truly going anywhere. He wasn't running toward something, he was running away. The truck's engine hummed steadily, the only real sound keeping him grounded in the present. But even that couldn't silence the thoughts creeping in, the memories he tried so hard to bury. His hands tightened around the steering wheel as he exhaled sharply, forcing himself to focus on the road. The past couldn't hurt him if he kept moving. Or so he thought. Once, Ethan had been a man of action, a soldier who ran toward danger instead of away from it. He had lived for the thrill of saving lives, whether it was on the battlefield or later as a firefighter. The weight of responsibility had never scared him. He had been willing to risk it all again and again. But no amount of bravery could change the past. There had been a fire, one that should have been just another rescue. He had gone in, as he always did, determined to pull someone out of the flames. But something went wrong. A miscalculation. A delay. A single second too late. And just like that, a life slipped through his fingers. He could still see their face in his nightmares, could still hear the sound of collapsing beams, could still feel the heat licking at his back as he barely made it out himself. He had saved dozens before. He had saved some after. But that one failure, that one loss, it had broken something inside him. So he walked away. From the job, from the people who depended on him, from the man he used to be. He convinced himself that saving lives wasn't his purpose anymore. That it wasn't his burden to carry. He had sworn never to go back. But fate had other plans. A flash of movement caught his eye through the downpour. At first, it was nothing more than a dark shape in the water. A trick of the storm, perhaps. But as another bolt of lightning illuminated the valley, he saw it clearly. A horse. A wild Mustang, battling against the raging floodwaters. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The animal was fighting with everything it had. Legs thrashing, neck straining, nostrils flaring wide as it struggled to keep its head above the surface. The river had turned into a monster, dragging the helpless creature downstream with terrifying force. For a moment, Ethan just watched, frozen in place. The Mustang wasn't going to make it. He could see that. The animal was strong, but even the strongest could only fight for so long. The current was too powerful, the debris too dangerous. It was a losing battle. His heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't his fight. He wasn't a rescuer anymore. He wasn't that man. He could drive away, pretend he never saw it, keep moving just like he always did. But something in him shifted. He had been running for so long, but what if this moment, this choice, was something he wasn't meant to run from? Another flash of lightning. Another glimpse of the Mustang's desperate struggle. Ethan cursed under his breath. Before he could talk himself out of it, he slammed on the brakes, threw the truck into park, and shoved the door open. Rain hit him like a wall as he stepped into the storm, his boots sinking into the mud. The cold wind bit at his skin, but he didn't care. His eyes were locked on the drowning horse. He had a choice to make, and this time he wasn't going to be too late. The rain was relentless, hammering the earth as if trying to drown the world itself. The once dry riverbed had transformed into a churning nightmare of debris and raging water, a monstrous force that consumed everything in its path. Ethan Walker stood frozen for only a second, watching the wild Mustang struggle against the powerful current. The horse's head barely remained above the water, its powerful legs kicking in desperation as exhaustion set in. The animal's muscles trembled, nostrils flaring wide as it sucked in frantic breaths. Every few seconds, it dipped below the surface before resurfacing, but Ethan knew, if he didn't act now, the next time Storm went under, he wouldn't come back up. His instincts screamed at him to turn away. Walk away, Ethan. This isn't your fight. You've done enough. You've lost enough. But something inside him refused to listen. Adrenaline surged through his veins as he yanked off his jacket and threw it aside. He didn't have a plan, just a burning, unshakable need to act. Years ago, he had been trained for dangerous rescues, taught to measure risks and assess the odds before making a move. But this wasn't a calculated mission. This was survival, raw and real. He took one step toward the river, then another. The wind howled like a beast as he reached the edge of the swollen floodwaters. The muddy ground was soft beneath his boots, already unstable. One wrong move and he could be swallowed whole just like Storm. Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. He had no equipment, no team, no backup, just him and the raging storm. He took a deep breath. Then, without another second of hesitation, he jumped. The second his body hit the water, a shockwave of cold ripped through him. It was like plunging into ice, stealing the air from his lungs and making his muscles seize instantly. The river was alive, thrashing and twisting like a wild beast, pulling him down, pushing him in every direction. Breathe, Ethan. Focus. He forced himself to move, fighting against the current as he set his eyes on the Mustang. The horse was only a few feet away, but the floodwaters made every inch feel like a mile. Storm was in full panic. The wild Mustang didn't see Ethan as a savior. He saw him as another threat. The stallion's eyes were wide with terror, whites showing as he flailed in the water. His massive hooves kicked in every direction, desperate to find solid ground that didn't exist. Every movement drained what little energy he had left. Ethan had to get close, but not too fast. A horse in fear could be just as dangerous as the storm itself. Easy, boy. Easy. Ethan shouted over the roar of the wind and rain, his voice rough, desperate. I'm not gonna hurt you. The Mustang's ears flicked slightly at the sound, but his fear was stronger than his trust. He kicked harder, his powerful legs barely missing Ethan's head. Ethan cursed under his breath. If Storm knocked him out here, they were both dead. He slowed his approach, moving deliberately, forcing himself to ignore the way the cold was numbing his limbs. He needed to find a way to calm the horse. Fast. But then, Storm's body twisted violently in the water. A sharp cry tore from the Mustang's throat, his back legs suddenly flailing in wild, uncontrolled bursts. Ethan saw it a second too late, a half-submerged log. Storm's hind leg had gotten caught in a mess of debris, trapping him. The horse's panic exploded tenfold. And in his terror, he kicked. The impact was like being hit by a battering ram. Storm's hoof struck Ethan square in the ribs, a brutal, crushing blow that sent a shockwave of pain through his entire body. The force ripped him away from the horse, and before he could even register what had happened, the water swallowed him whole. Darkness, cold, silence. The roaring storm above became distant as Ethan plunged downward, twisting violently in the underwater chaos. His body was weightless yet heavy, spinning in the blackness. He had lost all sense of direction. Up, down, right, left. It all blurred into nothing. His lungs screamed. His instincts fought against him. Don't breathe. Don't open your mouth. Hold on. But the pressure in his chest was unbearable. His ribs throbbed from the kick. His limbs felt sluggish, weak. This was it. This was how it ended. A flood. A stupid, reckless decision. A wild horse. Ethan had survived war zones, fires, explosions, and now he was going to drown in a nameless river alone. No, no. His fingers brushed something in the water. A rope? No, not a rope. A fence wire, half submerged, caught in the flood. It was slick and unstable, but it was something to hold on to. With the last of his strength, Ethan grabbed it. Pain exploded through his chest as he yanked himself upward, muscles burning, ribs screaming. His head finally broke through the surface, and he gasped. A raw, desperate gulp of air that burned his throat. He coughed violently, forcing water from his lungs. But he didn't have time to stop, because Storm was still out there, still struggling, still fighting, and so was he. Ethan had made his choice, and he wasn't about to let either of them go down. The storm raged on, merciless and unyielding. Ethan sucked in a ragged breath, his chest burning from the kick, his limbs heavy with exhaustion. The freezing water made every movement feel sluggish, but he forced himself to focus. Storm was still struggling. The Mustang's frantic movements had slowed, his body sinking deeper into the raging current. His once powerful legs, built for galloping across open plains, now barely managed to keep him afloat. The wild fight was draining out of him, and Ethan knew, if he didn't act now, there would be no second chance. Gritting his teeth against the pain, he lunged forward, forcing his way through the water. Each step was a battle against the current, his body threatening to be dragged under again. But he refused to let go. Storm let out a panicked cry, his eyes rolling back in terror. His hind leg was still caught in the mess of submerged debris, and the more he struggled, the tighter it became. Ethan needed a way to free him. Fast. Years of training kicked in. Assess. Adapt. Act. His hands moved blindly beneath the water, searching for the source of the entanglement. His fingers met resistance. A cluster of sharp branches twisted together, trapping Storm's leg like a snare. The Mustang jerked at the touch, nearly hitting Ethan again. "Easy, boy," Ethan rasped, spitting out water. "I got you." His fingers dug into the tangle of wood and debris. It was a mess of broken logs, vines, and river sludge, all woven together by the raging flood, too strong to break with bare hands. But Ethan wasn't about to give up. Bracing himself, he grabbed hold of one of the thickest branches, twisting and pulling with everything he had. His muscles screamed. His breath came in sharp, painful bursts. But finally, with a deep, splintering crack, the branch gave way. Storm jerked as his leg was freed, his body lurching forward. But the sudden movement knocked Ethan off balance, and before he could react, the current ripped them both away. Ethan barely had time to brace before the floodwaters dragged him down again. This time, there was no moment of control, just chaos. The Mustang was flailing, the force of the current tossing him violently. Ethan was no better. His body twisted and spun, the powerful water slamming him into unseen debris. He needed something to hold on to, something to stop the river from dragging them both to their deaths. And then he saw it. A stretch of barbed wire fencing, partially submerged, tangled in the remains of an old wooden post. It was risky, the metal was sharp, unforgiving, but it was a lifeline. Gritting his teeth, Ethan lunged toward it, his fingers outstretched and grabbed hold. The pain was immediate. The sharp metal tore into his palms, hot streaks of agony burning through his skin. But he didn't let go. He used every ounce of strength left in his body to pull himself up, fighting against the current. Storm was still thrashing, too exhausted to control his movements. If Ethan didn't act fast, the river would take him again. Ignoring the pain in his hands, Ethan reached for the Mustang's mane, grabbing a fistful of wet, tangled hair. "Come on, boy," he gasped, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Stay with me." Storm shuddered but didn't fight him. His muscles trembled beneath Ethan's grip, his wild energy drained. Using the barbed wire as leverage, Ethan began pulling them both forward. Inch by inch, step by step, the current fought against him, each movement feeling like an impossible battle. His legs burned, his ribs screamed, but he kept going, because failure was not an option. The river refused to let them go. Every time Ethan thought they were making progress, another wave crashed against them, threatening to drag them back into the abyss. His body was shaking from exhaustion, his arms heavy with the weight of holding onto both the Mustang and the barbed wire. Storm was barely standing. His once mighty form sagged against Ethan, his breaths coming in short, ragged bursts. Just a little more, Ethan gritted out, forcing one foot in front of the other. The shore was close, so damn close. A fallen tree lay partially submerged just ahead, its massive trunk wedged between two boulders. If they could reach it, they could climb out. But the current was unrelenting. Another powerful surge hit them, and this time, it was strong enough to rip Ethan's grip from the barbed wire. The force sent them both tumbling, the world spinning into a blur of water and darkness. For a moment, Ethan thought, this is it. This is where it ends. But then, his body slammed against something solid. The tree. The impact knocked the breath from his lungs, but he didn't let the pain slow him down. His fingers scrambled for a hold, gripping the rough bark with what little strength he had left. Storm was barely conscious, his body drifting just a few feet away. With a final, desperate effort, Ethan reached out and caught the Mustang's mane. With a groan of pain, he pulled. Storm kicked weakly, his body fighting for survival even in his weakest moment. And then, they broke free. One last heave, one last push, and finally, they collapsed onto solid ground. The rain still poured, the river still raged, but they had made it. Soaked, battered, and utterly drained, but alive. Ethan lay on his back, chest rising and falling in ragged gasps. His ribs throbbed, his hands bled, but none of it mattered, because beside him, Storm was still breathing. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt something he thought he had lost. Hope. Ethan's body was numb, his breath ragged, his lungs burned, his muscles screamed, and the metallic taste of blood coated his tongue. Every fiber of his being told him to stop, that he had nothing left to give. But he wasn't done yet. Beside him, Storm lay motionless, his massive frame heaving with exhaustion. The Mustang's eyes were half closed, his body trembling violently from cold and exertion. His once powerful legs, built for galloping across endless plains, now barely twitched in the mud. They had escaped the river's deadliest grip, but they were far from safe. The floodwaters still surged around them, the ground beneath them slick and unstable. The small patch of land they had collapsed on was nothing more than a narrow strip of muddy terrain, surrounded by the raging current. Ethan pushed himself up with a groan. His hands stung where the barbed wire had torn through his skin, and his ribs ached with every breath. He knew he didn't have much time. Either they moved now or they wouldn't move at all. The Mustang let out a weak, shuddering breath. His nostrils flared, but his legs didn't move. Ethan swallowed hard. "Come on, buddy," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "You gotta get up." He placed a hand on the horse's soaked coat, feeling the erratic rise and fall of his ribs. Storm's body was cold, too cold. The longer he stayed down, the greater the risk of him going into shock. The Mustang let out a soft, exhausted whinny. He was fading. No, Ethan wasn't going to let this happen. Not now. Not after everything they had survived. Digging deep into whatever strength he had left, he shifted onto his knees and grabbed a fistful of Storm's mane. "Get up," he urged, pulling gently. "Come on, boy. I know you can." Storm's ears flicked, but his body remained still. Ethan clenched his jaw. His own limbs were barely responding, but he had to find a way to get them both out of this. He glanced around, searching for anything that could help. The land ahead sloped upward. If they could just make it up that incline, they would be safe from the rising water. But Storm wouldn't make it on his own. And Ethan, well, he wasn't about to leave him behind. With a deep breath, Ethan braced himself and stood. His legs nearly gave out beneath him, but he forced himself to stay upright. He reached down, gripping Storm's halter, his fingers tightening around the soaked leather. "One more time, buddy," he murmured. "Just one more push." Storm's breathing was labored, his muscles twitching. Ethan knew he was asking for a miracle, but he wasn't about to let this Mustang die here. He planted his feet and pulled. Storm groaned, his body trembling beneath Ethan's grip. "Come on," Ethan urged, his voice growing desperate. "You've fought this hard. Don't give up on me now." The Mustang's ears flicked again. His nostrils flared, and then he moved. It was barely more than a twitch at first, but then Storm let out a deep, rumbling breath and shifted his front legs. The motion sent ripples through the mud, and Ethan's heart leaped. "Yes, that's it. Come on." He pulled harder, ignoring the burning in his arms, the fire in his ribs. Every muscle in his body protested, but he would not stop. Storm let out a labored grunt, his body swaying. His hind legs struggled for traction, slipping against the wet ground. Ethan clenched his jaw and moved to his side, placing his shoulder beneath the Mustang's massive head. "I got you," he whispered. With one final, desperate effort, Storm pushed off the ground. For a second, Ethan thought he wouldn't make it. But then the Mustang staggered to his feet. He wobbled, his legs trembling, but he was standing. Ethan let out a sharp breath of relief, gripping Storm's mane to steady himself. But they weren't safe yet. The land ahead was steep, the incline muddy and slick from the storm. One wrong step and they'd be back in the floodwaters. Ethan exhaled, glancing up at the slope. His vision blurred for a moment from sheer exhaustion, but he forced himself to focus. "One more stretch," he muttered, half to himself, half to Storm. "Just a little further." Storm's ears flicked toward him, as if he understood. With staggering steps, Ethan led the Mustang forward. Every step was a struggle. The mud sucked at their feet, the wind howled around them, and the rain continued to pour. At one point, Ethan's knee buckled, and he nearly collapsed. But a warm muzzle pressed against his shoulder, Storm, steadying him. He swallowed hard. The Mustang was just as exhausted as he was, but he was still fighting. Together they climbed. Felt like an eternity. Every step was agony, but inch by inch they made it. And then, the ground leveled out. Ethan barely registered the change before his legs gave out, sending him sprawling onto his back. His chest rose and fell in gasps, his body shuddering from exhaustion. Beside him, Storm collapsed too, his large frame hitting the ground with a heavy thud. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The rain still fell, the wind still howled, but none of it mattered, because they had made it. Ethan turned his head slightly, his vision swimming as he looked at Storm. The Mustang was breathing deep, steady breaths. A tired smile pulled at Ethan's lips. They had survived, and against all odds they had done it together. Ethan lay on the soaked ground, his body refusing to move. His muscles were burning, his breath coming in ragged gasps, and every inch of him felt like it had been torn apart. But the pain didn't matter because he was alive, and so was Storm. The Mustang's massive frame lay beside him, his chest rising and falling in deep, exhausted breaths. His coat was soaked, streaked with mud and cuts from the barbed wire and debris. His muscles twitched from exertion, and his eyes remained half-closed, his ears flicking only slightly at the distant sound of rolling thunder. For a long time, neither of them moved. The storm had passed, the winds had calmed, but the world around them still felt eerily still, like nature itself was catching its breath after the violent battle they had fought. Ethan slowly turned his head to look at Storm. The Mustang had fought just as hard as he had. Against the brutal current. Against exhaustion. Against death itself. Ethan exhaled shakily, his heart pounding with something he hadn't felt in a long time, awe. He had seen bravery before. He had seen it in fellow soldiers, in firefighters rushing into burning buildings, in people who refused to give up even when the odds were against them. But this Mustang, this wild, untamed creature, had fought with a strength and resilience that Ethan had never witnessed before. Storm had wanted to live, and in some strange, unspoken way, Ethan knew that he had wanted him to live too. His throat tightened as he turned his gaze toward the sky. The dark clouds were beginning to break apart, slivers of golden light pushing through like the world was trying to heal itself. The rain had become a soft drizzle, cooling his battered skin. For the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel like a ghost drifting through life. He felt alive. A low, deep sound broke the silence. Ethan blinked, turning his head again. Storm had shifted slightly, his long legs sprawled out, his powerful chest still rising and falling. Then, something happened that Ethan never expected. The Mustang turned his head toward him. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't just a random movement. Storm's dark, intelligent eyes locked onto Ethan's, and for a moment, they simply stared at one another. Ethan felt his breath hitch. There was no fear in the Mustang's gaze. No wild panic, no instinct to run. Instead, there was something else. Something deeper. Recognition. Storm knew. He knew Ethan had saved him. The Mustang let out a slow, tired huff of breath, his ears flicking forward slightly. Then, he did something Ethan never would have imagined. With the last bit of energy he had left, Storm stretched his long neck forward and gently nudged Ethan's arm with his muzzle. The touch was light, subtle, but it sent a shockwave through Ethan's chest. It wasn't just a casual movement. It wasn't just exhaustion making Storm act this way. It was gratitude. Ethan swallowed hard, his fingers twitching as he resisted the urge to reach out. He had never believed in things like fate. He had spent years shutting himself off from the world, convincing himself that nothing truly mattered, that saving lives wasn't always enough. But this moment, this connection, felt like something he couldn't explain. This Mustang had fought for his life, and somehow, in the process, he had reminded Ethan how to fight for his own. Storm nudged him again, a little firmer this time, and Ethan let out a soft, breathless chuckle. "You're something else, you know that?" he murmured, his voice hoarse. The Mustang huffed again as if agreeing, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan smiled. The sun was setting now, casting golden streaks across the sky. The floodwaters had begun to recede, leaving behind pools of muddy water and scattered debris. The land was still broken, still scarred from the storm, but it was healing, and so was Ethan. He sat up slowly, his entire body protesting, but he ignored it. Storm lifted his head slightly, watching him with quiet eyes. This was the moment of truth. Ethan had told himself over and over again that he didn't do rescues anymore. That saving things, saving people, saving animals, saving himself wasn't worth it. But now, as he looked at the Mustang beside him, he felt something stir inside him. He could leave. He could walk away right now, let Storm return to the wild, let this entire experience become just another story in his past. But something about that thought made his chest tighten. He looked at Storm again. The Mustang was weak, still trembling, still healing from his ordeal. He wouldn't survive alone. Not yet. Ethan let out a slow breath. Maybe this wasn't just about saving Storm. Maybe this was about saving both of them. With effort, he got to his feet, his legs shaking beneath him. Storm's ears flicked at the movement, but he didn't flinch. He didn't run. Ethan took a slow step forward. The Mustang watched him carefully. Another step. Storm didn't move. Ethan exhaled and reached out, his hand hovering just above the Mustang's soaked coat. For a second, he hesitated. Then, gently, he laid his hand against Storm's shoulder. The Mustang didn't pull away, didn't flinch. didn't run. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat tight. He had spent years pushing people away. Years convincing himself that he was better off alone. But this Mustang had fought for his life. And now, standing there together, Ethan realized something. Maybe neither of them was meant to be alone anymore. A slow, tired smile tugged at the corners of his lips. "All right, buddy," he murmured, his voice quieter than the wind. "Let's go home." Storm huffed softly, his ears twitching forward. And as the last light of the sun faded behind them, man and Mustang took their first steps forward. Together. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful tales of resilience, courage, and unexpected bonds. What would you have done in Ethan's place? Let us know in the comments below. And remember, sometimes saving a life can change your own. Stay tuned for more incredible stories. Horse Blue Heart.